I am just thrilled to welcome Dr. Lakeya Cherry, a distinguished expert in social work and executive leadership with over 25 years of experience. I could probably spend the next 90 minutes just listing the different ways that she's dedicated her life to making an impact, beginning with social work at the Harlem Children's Zone and the New York Center for Children, evolving that into social work field development and nonprofit management, ultimately becoming a partner at Evolution, Silicon Valley's premier firm for coaching and consulting. She's also the founder of Lakeya Cherry LLC, where she helps leaders and organizations achieve their goals. Known for her work in fostering courageous and inclusive leadership, she also serves as commissioner for the City of San Diego Commission for Women. Drawing from her certification as a Dare to Lead Facilitator, today she'll talk about HR's pivotal role in cultivating courageous leadership in the workplace, grounded in Brené Brown's powerful work. So with that, please join me in giving Dr. Lakeya Cherry a very warm welcome.
Thank you for that introduction. She apparently did some digging. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. I'm really excited for today's conversation, so let's get started. So to lead others, you must first lead yourself. What does that even mean? As HR leaders, all of you have been leading in a time unlike any other. You've had to pivot, remember that word, as well as navigate so many things. You've had to be the first ones to extend support, provide guidance, and you're oftentimes the first ones to put out fires. But the harsh reality is you're also oftentimes the first one to get blamed when something goes wrong. Let me ask you this. With everything that you're currently navigating, with everything that you've navigated, how often are you prioritizing yourself? As you heard, I have a social work background. I'm also from a helping profession, so my guess is rarely, if ever, are you prioritizing yourself. We just met, but we all know, we've heard it many times, that you can't pour from an empty cup. And so my conversation with you all today is to guide you through what you've been through, to allow you to feel seen and heard, but also to talk about what's to come. The changing landscape of HR, our organizations are continuing to undergo change. So what will that mean for you moving forward? You heard a very detailed, elaborate bio of me, but a little bit more details. Yes, I'm an executive coach. I'm a team coach as well as a leadership coach, but in many ways, I'm a reluctant entrepreneur. I started my career off as a social worker in direct practice. I started off in New York City, then went to California, where I'm from, and I realized quickly that I needed to take a seat at the table and that it was important for me to find my way to leadership. As I moved up the table and moved into a leadership role, I became the CEO of an organization called the Network for Social Work Management. I was the CEO of this nonprofit for 9 years, often navigating a lot. I learned a lot about organizational culture, I learned a lot about HR, and I learned a lot about the things behind the scenes that we don't often talk about. In that role, a role that I loved, I didn't often feel appreciated, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which led me to entrepreneurship, hence the reluctant entrepreneurship title. And so as we dive into today, I've never been an HR professional, but I know a little bit about what you're going through, and I want you to know that I see you and I appreciate the very difficult, challenging role that all of you have within your organizations. I respect the role that you play, and I want to thank BalancedComp for the opportunity to be here to greet you as well as to support you. So for today's talk, we have quite a bit of time together. We're going to talk a little bit first about the modern HR leader. Who are you today, and what are you navigating since the pandemic? What is the changing landscape before you? What is the future of HR? In many ways, I like to talk about the future because the future is here now, and if you're not going to pay attention, you're not going to be able to co-create the future. Brave leaders, I'm also a Brené Brown certified Dare to Lead facilitator. So with that, I do a lot of work with organizations around vulnerability and courage. But what does it mean to be a brave leader in today's world, within today's organizations? Then I'll talk about the heart of daring leadership. Unfortunately, vulnerability is a really important part of that. Many people fear the word vulnerability, and they don't like being vulnerable. They don't understand the role vulnerability plays within an organizational context, which we'll talk about. And then we'll talk about, for all of you, with all that you're navigating, which is a lot, I did my research, how do you create sustainable growth moving forward? So the modern HR leader, how many of you remember the pandemic? Right? How can you forget? Right? How can you forget? I remember I was in the middle of my doctoral program. I was so excited to be done. I was also in the middle of planning my organization's annual conference. And then out of nowhere, there was all these conversations of this global virus, people dying, we didn't know what was going to happen, whether there would be a vaccine, what this meant for the future. All I know is that I was scared. Everything had went in a somewhat predictable manner, but out of nowhere, things were changing overnight, and I was left to my own devices to figure out how I was going to navigate it. So for all of you, you also were there with me, globally, all of us were, to navigate the pandemic. You experienced a lot of changes in your personal life. Some of you who are parents, you had to deal with what teachers were dealing with all day with your children at home. Some of you with your spouses, you were working from home together. And it caused so much turmoil within our personal lives as well as within our professional lives. You as HR leaders, you had to navigate so many transformations. So as I go through the next set of slides, I want you to pause and really think about what was it like for you in this particular moment. So remote work. I often joke with people, I've been working from home for over 10 years. So when the pandemic happened, I felt that it was unfair that all of you were now working from home with me, and that now I had to be on camera. Before there was conference calls, remember conference calls? And now all of a sudden everyone wants me visible on Zoom, on Teams. I couldn't just run to get my nails done because I had to work like none other than before because everybody was now at home working nonstop. So for you, many of you, especially working in the banking and credit union industry, many of you probably worked in the office. Many of you probably never had to work from home. And even if you still had to work from the office, things changed overnight. I bet there was hand sanitizer everywhere, everyone was wearing masks, and there was a significant distance in which you had to stay away from each other. Again, these are all inconvenient truths that we all had to navigate within the workplace. So I want you to take a moment and think about, what was it like for you in that moment? You know, what was it like for you? Did you still have to go to work? Were you now working from home and you had to navigate technology, competing with, your partner and your children and the internet? What was that like for you? Many of you likely had the daunting task of establishing new communication systems. You had to maintain company culture. Remember those virtual happy hours and book clubs that everyone was having? You had to ensure that your team members felt supported, all while evolving technologies and security concerns were before you. These are all things that you had to navigate. And truth be told, it sucked, right? It was uncomfortable. It was difficult. Some of you excelled at it, and some of you perhaps, had a difficult time. But these aren't things that we really talked about. You were just expected to deal with it and to do it well and to move on because this was our new reality. And then there was the Great Resignation. Remember that? I actually was a member of the Great Resignation. 4.5 million Americans voluntarily left their jobs in 2021. When you think about the Great Resignation, this was completely unheard of. We had never seen anything like this before. I was so mesmerized by people constantly quitting their jobs without anything else that I started researching it. I was studying it. Every month, I was looking for the trends and the signals. Oftentimes, what happened was people realized with the pandemic, if we can't predict the future, if something like this could happen overnight, that I need to take control of my destiny, I need to take control of my future, and I refuse to be part of a toxic workplace culture. Also, I'm a social worker. As many of you know, social work is a female-dominated industry, much like HR. And so in female-dominated industries, oftentimes we're also caretakers. We're caretakers at work and we're caretakers at home. So what this meant was, with many of us working from home, not only are we responsible for everything at work, now we're responsible for taking care of our parents, taking care of our spouses, taking care of our children, and anyone else who needed our support. This was a lot, and it was something that many people couldn't manage. On the other hand, when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, some people realized working from home, it was better to be at home away from the office than dealing with microaggressions and other toxic behavior in the office. I would rather be at home or choose a new environment than to have to go back to the way things were done before. And so I want you to think about the impact of the Great Resignation for you. Did you leave? Or as an HR leader, were you poised with scrambling to deal with the high turnover in your organization? That you pick up a heavy caseload because of the people who are resigning from your place of work, who were choosing something different. And then there was return to work initiatives. For those of you who had the lovely opportunity to experience what it's like to work from home, that level of freedom, out of nowhere, many organizations realize, no, we're paying all these hefty costs for real estate, for our office spaces. I need to know what you're doing. Even though the research has shown that many of us were still doing our work, many of us had to return to the office. As an executive coach, I work with so many organizations who out of nowhere decided to return to the office. This was unfortunate because during the time of the pandemic, many people got rid of one of their cars. They decided to downsize their home. Many people moved to relocate closer to their families. Many people transitioned their way of doing things, and then out of nowhere, they were expected to return to work. So if this was you, or this was your organizational culture, again, what was the impact of everyone being back in the office after being gone for so many years? One company that I worked with, they decided seemingly overnight that everyone had to return, but they didn't think through all of the details. So what happened was people were returning to offices without an office. People had nowhere to go for private meetings. People had nowhere to go for lunch. People were sitting on floors just to get their work done because they had to return to the office. So what was the impact for you? Again, if you were already there, but your organization was transitioning, what was the impact for you amidst all of this change? How many of you have experienced stress or burnout at work? Quick show of hands. I hear the giggles. Yes. So you also, whether you had to deal with a remote work culture or return to work, many of you had increased demand and stress. The financial industry is known for its high stress environment, long hours and intense pressure. You're dealing with money, right? Did it get worse for you during the pandemic? Did you have more work and more crazy demands? As you see here with this statistic, 94% of HR leaders say employee burnout was a major concern. Most of us are achievers, workaholics. We're very accustomed to working hard, but did you work unlike any other? I mean, there wasn't really much to do, so why not, right? But what was the impact on you? What is the impact now? HR professionals, regardless of whether you work in financial compensation or not, you're often tasked with dealing with employee burnout for others within the organization, mental health issues, also helping others to navigate work-life balance. But how often are you paying attention to these very things for yourself? Again, you work for a helping profession where you're tending to other people's needs, but how often are you tending to yourself? I want you to think about, how do you feel currently and how are you navigating the stress? Yes, there's employee assistance programs. Yes, there's coaches like myself. There's therapists, but are you referring others to these services or are you actually utilizing them for yourself? And then, of course, economic challenges and downturn. We all have seen the impact of inflation across our country. I remember being at the grocery store recently to get some almond milk, and it cost $7. $7 for a pitcher of milk. I live in San Diego, California. We went through an egg crisis where you couldn't find a dozen of eggs anywhere, and if you did, you had to pay $10. Gas in San Diego has fluctuated anywhere between $5 to $6.50 at a time. Again, these are crazy things that are our actual reality that we're all navigating. But what has been the impact for you within your places of work, within your organizations? And then there's regulatory compliance. Again, all of you deal with the financial industry. You're dealing with data, you're dealing with numbers, you have to be in compliance. I mentioned when I first started, you're responsible for so much, but you're also responsible if anything goes wrong. You have been responsible for helping your organizations get back to business as usual. But what this also means is you're also responsible for continuing to learn and continuing to navigate the evolving laws and regulations. As an HR leader, again, are you aware of everything you've been through and everything that you've navigated? How often are you taking the time to pat yourself on the back for all that you've achieved? So this next slide is a vulnerable slide. I mentioned I'm a Brené Brown Dare to Lead Facilitator. So you're probably wondering why there's a photo of me crying. So with my introduction, I mentioned that I used to be a nonprofit CEO. Like many others, self-included, the pandemic really tested me. I've always been a chronic achiever, but never before have I felt so tested and out of control. This is a picture of me in the middle of transition. I was in the middle of my nonprofit speech, my final speech as CEO of the organization, before transitioning to operating my own business. I had always been the pillar of professionalism, executive presence, and as I was giving the speech, I completely lost it and broke down crying. I was so mortified. I was absolutely mortified, and everyone started clapping for me and yelling out, "You're human, it's okay, let the tears fly," which made me cry more. Never before had I felt so seen and so supported and mortified. I'm someone who has traditionally worn my armor like a badge of armor. I've been taught that you have to present a certain kind of way. You have to be a certain kind of way, that you can't cry at work. I'm not advocating that you cry at work. But I've been told that you can't let people know when you make a mistake. You can't ask for help because people will think that you're weak, that you have to show up as if you're superhuman, with that cape flying high, even though that you're dealing with so much inside. And so when I was giving the speech, I realized that I had given 9 years of my career to this organization. I had worked so incredibly hard, and I was leaving at a time where I felt completely destroyed. I didn't feel appreciated. I didn't feel seen. I didn't feel supported. I wasn't receiving the compensation that I should have been receiving. And after all of my labor, I just felt taken for granted. And this was an organization that I had helped build and that I really, truly believed in. So I was completely heartbroken that I had to say goodbye in order to choose myself. Nowadays, I'm much more comfortable with vulnerability, as you can see here by the crying photo. I'm not going to cry, but crying in public isn't me, yet here I was. Truth be told, I was burnt out, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was coming before me. I took this photo after the talk as a reminder. I wanted to remember how I felt in that moment. I wanted to remember what it took for me to walk away from this organization and what the tears were actually about. I use this photo as a reminder of my value, of my worth, of my humanness. Through my navigation, I transitioned about 2.5 years ago. I've realized that I am the captain of my ship. I have the ability to choose how I'm going to show up and what the outcomes for my life are. And so as I continue today's talk, I want to remind you all, you are the captain of your ship. Yes, you are responsible for so much, but you also have the ability to choose what happens to you and how you navigate the crazy terrain that's before you. So let's talk about the changing landscape of HR. So again, you all had to pivot. All of us have had to pivot. I thought that I was going to be graduating with my doctoral degree in Washington, D.C. Instead, I was in my apartment with pajama pants on, defending my dissertation. So much has happened, but look at us here today. We have survived. And so when you think about yourself and what's before you, how closely are you paying attention to the changing landscape of HR? As a futurist, I often tell people, are you paying attention to the signals? We're in a new political environment. I'm not going to talk about politics, so no worries. But are you paying attention to the trends and what we're seeing in the world and the implications for all of you in your day-to-day work, as well as in your personal lives? So the changing landscape has increased significantly over the last 5 years. What this means is increased regulatory changes, which means increased learning on your behalf, increased compliance, increased expectations, which means increased work, and likely increased burnout. So for all of you as HR leaders, you're navigating all of this, but how are you navigating it for yourself? Are you taking care of yourself? Are you sleeping? Are you eating balanced meals? Are you taking your vacations? What does all of these changes mean for you? How are you going to sustain the work before you if you're not taking care of yourself? I asked you, how many of you have felt burnout or stress? As you see here, 95% of HR leaders find working in HR to be overwhelming due to excessive workload and stress. As an executive coach, I've coached many HR leaders. I've never had a client come to me crying as much as the HR leaders that I coach. They have no one to turn to oftentimes within their organization. So as this external consultant, as this external source of support, they're oftentimes coming to their sessions crying to me. Again, you all are responsible for so much, but who's responsible for tending to you? Who's looking out for you? You're expected to work at a relentless pace amidst the evolving regulations and increased scope of responsibilities. You've had to become strategic business partners. You've had to become mental health advocates, crisis managers, and change agents. A few years ago, the Surgeon General, released a report indicating that over 85% of workers indicated that they now had a mental health challenge due to their workplace. 85% of workers were experiencing mental health challenges due to their workplace. Again, we're all navigating so much. What is the impact? And how are you navigating it for yourself? A lack of resources. Regardless of your industry, one of the things that I've noticed working with organizations, you're not oftentimes allocating budget to support your people and support the work that you're responsible for. In your ever-changing landscape, with all of the compliance and regulatory changes that you're responsible for, do you have the data systems to support you? Do you have the payroll management systems to support you? Do you have the headcount to support you? And if not, again, what are the implications? Hopefully I'm not depressing you, but I do want you to know that I see you and I understand what you're up against. And if we don't have this conversation, it's hard to understand how you go from here. So what is the future of HR? How are you planning for tomorrow? The future of HR is dynamic. It's complex. It's going to be different from any of the other traditional models. If you think back to before the pandemic in 2020, many of you were likely operating completely different from how you're operating now. So if you think about 5 years from now, what are the signals that you're seeing, and how do you think you're going to have to navigate the changes before you? You all are unicorns. You've had to navigate some crazy terrain, but again, you're not superhuman. You don't wear a cape. There's a vulnerable side of you that still needs support. What we're going to talk about is how you're going to need to become daring, bold, audacious leaders in order to navigate what's before you. How many of you deal with data right now? Quick show of hands. Exactly, most of you. So you're data-driven decision makers. I often like to tell people the data rarely lies. And so you have to understand numbers, you have to understand research, and you have to know what to do with it. You have to be able to make decisions based on the trends, based on the insights that you're seeing. You have to look at predictive analytics to figure out how you're going to manage the budgets and how you're going to negotiate what's to come. You have to have a seat at the table to have these very important conversations based on what you're seeing from the data. How many of you deal with employees? Yeah, exactly, right? So you're also employee experience advocates. As I mentioned, over 85% of the workplace right now are dealing with mental health challenges and burnout since the pandemic, which is the highest since it's been since the Great Depression. So not only are you responsible for data and predictive analytics and helping the organization stay financially sound, but you're also responsible for the experience of your employees. You're responsible for advocacy, for equity. You're responsible for ensuring that employees feel supported. Oftentimes, you're assisting with wellness programs and leadership initiatives, and you're trying to balance profitability with employee well-being. But again, with all that you're tasked to do, what does that look like for you? My guess is, again, you're tending to everyone else but yourself. And then your DEI champions. So DEI is apparently canceled right now, but regardless of how you feel about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, you believe in the importance of equity. You believe in the importance of fairness. And all of you as HR professionals, you're tasked with navigating this behind the scenes within your organization. You are tasked with being the champion for your company culture. Many of us know that the likelihood of greater diversity within your organizations leads to greater inclusion, which leads to greater profitability and business outcomes. But this can be a very, very, very challenging terrain to navigate. Yet again, many of you are responsible for doing this alongside all of your other many responsibilities. You're also a facilitator of learning. You're consistently having to learn to keep up with this changing landscape. Again, if things go wrong, you're oftentimes, unfairly, the first to be blamed. So you have to, fortunately, come to wonderful conferences such as this, but you're also oftentimes having to get CEs as well as go through other trainings to keep up with the pace of how everything is changing. You're responsible for data privacy, workforce policies. Again, you have to continue growing and learning, but you're also responsible for ensuring that your company is continuing to grow and learn. You're also strategic partners. How many of you have a seat at the table now? Obviously, you're sitting at a table, but how many of you intimately feel that you have a seat at the table? In my experience as a social worker and working with HR professionals, many of them see themselves as just helpers. They don't necessarily see themselves as leaders. They see themselves as carriers of information where they give it to the leadership team, and then it's up to the leadership team to make a decision. In our changing landscape, the future of HR is going to require that you take that seat at the table, that you don't wait to be invited, that you take it. You have information and insights unlike any other within the organization. Again, you are unicorns. You know where all the skeletons are. You know all the workings of the organization. You have crucial fundamental information that your organizations need. You not only must take that seat at the table, you deserve to have a seat at the table. So how do you do this? Again, we've talked about everything that you've navigated, a little depressing, especially with my crying photo. We also spoke about everything that's before you. Again, it's going to take a lot of strong, resilient leaders in order to muster what's before you. So how will you do it? Brave leaders and courageous coachers. This is going to require vulnerability and courage. I mentioned a lot of people don't like the word vulnerability. It makes them uncomfortable. Even me just saying it, I could feel my hands getting clammy. It's kind of giving me an ick feeling, right? So how do you grapple with this? I'm going to share over the next series of slides some of Dr. Brené Brown's research around daring leadership. My hope is that this is going to inspire you to lean into authentic connections, build trust, and become more innovative leaders who demand the seat at the table that you rightfully deserve. So barriers to courage. So in her research, Dr. Brené Brown she interviewed 500 CEOs across the country, and she asked them, what does courage look like within their organizations? Unfortunately, they didn't have an answer. What they came up with is this list that you see on the screen. So all of these things that you see here are barriers to coaching and barriers to courage within organizations. So tough conversations. How many of you like having tough conversations? I don't. It can be incredibly uncomfortable. Yes, you're in HR, and many of you are very familiar with doing it. Many of you have to do it by nature of your job, but do you get excited? Do you wake up in the morning saying, I have to have this crucial conversation today? What I've learned from my work is that most people don't know how to have a tough conversation. Regardless of your education, regardless of your experience, regardless of your title or position, most people don't know how to have a tough conversation. So imagine that. If you don't know how to have a tough conversation, what are the implications within your organization? If you're stressed, if you're burnt out, if you made a mistake, if you need support, if you realize something from the data that has implications for the future of your organization, but you don't know how to have a conversation, again, what is the potential impact of this for your organizational culture? Fears and feelings. Think back to the Great Resignation. So many people left, and those who remained, many of you quietly or silently quit. You became resigned. Many of you said, okay, I have to be here, I have to do this. Many people decided that they were going to do the bare minimum to survive. Because again, not only were they grappling with the organizational shifts and changes, they were also grappling with the personal changes within their home life. So imagine that you're noticing and you're seeing all these people within your place of employment resigning, getting laid off, and now you're tasked with all this additional work. You're feeling some kind of way, right? I would be. But are you actually having conversations about this? Likely not, because again, tough conversations is a barrier to courage. So what happens is there's a lot of Eeyores running around the organization, feeling some kind of way, having a lot of feelings, which is coming out in apathy, which is coming out in anger and frustration. And you as HR professionals, again, the unicorns that you are, you're often tasked to deal with it, to navigate it, even when you're the people behind the scenes feeling some of that stuff as well. Corroding trust. Many people don't trust the people that they work with. Many people don't trust the leaders that they report to. So again, if this is what you're experiencing in your organizations, what are the implications? We spend 1/3 of our life at work. 1/3 of our life at work. That's insane. And so if 1/3 of your life is spent at work, wouldn't you want to wake up trusting and being able to have tough conversations with the people that you work with and the people that you report to? Many organizations are stuck in setbacks. We tried to be innovative. We tried to be creative. We tried to do something different, something new, and it didn't necessarily go as we predicted. Therefore, we're going to complain about it and we're never going to move forward. I've experienced that in places that I work for, and it can be incredibly uncomfortable. Instead of talking about what we could do better, we just complain and we commiserate around our misery. Problem-solving action bias. Then there's organizations who move too fast. There's a bias for action. As opposed to looking at the predictive analytics, to exploring the data and reviewing what has been done, where you came from, what you learned, you're poised to move forward a little bit too fast. There's issues with inclusivity, diversity, and equity, which again has implications for the future of your organization. And then shame and blame. Did you know shame is the #1 management tool used to keep employees in line? And so if you're feeling shame, shame is a sense of unworthiness, not feeling good. If you're not feeling your best, which is likely if you're stressed, burnt out, not feeling appreciated, what oftentimes happens is that you then bring that negative energy, those hurt feelings, onto the people you supervise and manage. So then, if you have a culture of people who are experiencing shame, imagine again the implications for your culture. Likelihood there's gossip, likelihood there's the after the meeting water cooler conversations, likelihood there's favoritism. Again, there's a lack of trust. What are the implications when people aren't tending to themselves? Usually they work it out on others that they work with. And then there's a blaming culture. Gallsy values. Most organizations have values. Most organizations, unfortunately, are performative in their values. And so what does this mean if your employees are coming to your organization desiring to work for a place that proclaims all of these things, and then they get there and they realize, we're not actually like this. This is just who we say we are on the surface. Again, that then has implications for the culture in-house. And many of you, as HR professionals, are unfortunately tasked to navigating all of that. And then perfectionism. I often tell people I'm a perfectionist in recovery. I've always been told that I should strive for excellence, that I need to work hard and I need to do my very best, but to me, that equated to perfection. Truth be told, none of us are perfect. I hate to break it to you, but none of us are perfect. But if you have a culture where everyone believes that they have to show up in a perfect manner, when they don't show up in a perfect manner, do you think they're having a tough conversation? Do you think they're telling the truth? Or do you think they're actually hiding what's going on behind the scenes? So again, these are some of the barriers to courage within our organizations. But courage is so valuable. Who we are is how we lead. If you don't know yourself, if you're not self-aware, if you're not in tune with those fears and feelings, again, it's going to show up in how you lead others. I mentioned that shame is the #1 management tool to keep people in line. And so imagine a leader who's feeling a ton of shame, perhaps due to the economic challenges and the impact on their organization. If they're not grappling with those fears and feelings, if they're not grappling with their shame as a leader who's having to navigate this, then all of you are going to deal with the repercussions. As leaders, it's important for us to become emotionally intelligent. We need to grapple with these feelings. Yes, that picture of me was embarrassing, but I took it, again, because I wanted the reminder of how I felt, so I can never put myself in that position to feel that way ever again. Research has shown that the number one blind spots for leaders are not asking for help. The higher you move up the ladder, the more likely that you're not as emotionally intelligent. Many leaders, as soon as they assume the ranks, they feel there's no longer a need to develop themselves. They have a lack of awareness of their behavior and the impact on other people. They start playing victim. Many of us have experienced that with leaders. They have a know-it-all attitude. I've certainly had some know-it-all leaders. They choose armored leadership over daring leadership. And they begin to tolerate good enough, especially for themselves. And so it's so important for us to know who we are as leaders. But for all of you as HR professionals, again, it's important for you to know how you're feeling and to consciously choose what you're going to do about it. How many of you love vulnerability? Exactly. I mentioned that vulnerability is uncomfortable, but it's a prerequisite to courage. When we talk about vulnerability, you all work with numbers. We're not talking about vulnerability to your systems. We're not talking about systemic vulnerability. We're talking about relational vulnerability, the ability to come before you and to share that crying, sad photo of myself, or to admit that I'm actually tired, that I'm burnt out, that I'm overworked, that I'm fatigued, that I need support, that I'm not actually perfect. This is vulnerability. All of you showing up here is vulnerability. Your first date is vulnerability. Your first time interviewing for a new job is vulnerability. The first time you got promoted, that's vulnerability. When you first have a child, that's vulnerability. These are all things that we navigate every day. We're going to experience vulnerability whether we like it or not. When I mentioned COVID, I said, how many of you remember COVID? And you laughed. The thing about COVID is my number one measure of vulnerability. Everyone around the world were vulnerable immediately at once. Literally, all of us were vulnerable. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't know what the future held. We all were vulnerable. When you went to the grocery store, I don't know how it was for you, but all of the aisles, especially toilet paper and canned food, was wiped out. Again, people were feeling vulnerable. People were scared. At the crux of vulnerability is feelings of shame. I know shame very well. Again, I'm a perfectionist in recovery. For me, I oftentimes question my worth and whether I'm good enough. And it shows up in trying to overperform, excel, overachieve. The thing about shame, most people don't talk about it. They feel those feelings internally, but they don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to be judged, so they deal with it themselves, if they even deal with it. And then there's scarcity. I grew up in a single-parent working-class household. I'm first generation. I know scarcity. No matter how much money I make now, no matter where I went to school, what education or experience I have, I often have a fear of being homeless. I often have a fear of not having enough. So if you are someone who experienced scarcity, again, what's the likelihood that you're willing to be vulnerable and put yourselves on the line if it might have later implications? And then fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. If you think about first responders, do you think when a fireman is running into a burning building that they're not afraid? I would be. They're afraid, but they feel the fear and they do it anyways. And so vulnerability is difficult, vulnerability is challenging, vulnerability is uncomfortable, but as Brené always says, we need to embrace the suck. If we desire more courageous workplaces, then vulnerability is a prerequisite to this. So oftentimes when I give talks around vulnerability, people say, well, Lakeya, I'm not going to start crying at work. So when I say vulnerability at work, I don't mean that you should boo-hoo and cry and tell everyone your business. What I mean by vulnerability at work is admitting when you're wrong, telling the truth, owning up to being human. When you don't know something, just saying, I actually don't know that, but I'm willing to find the answers and look it up. Most people don't do it. Most people will BS you and come up with all types of random explanations, as opposed to just acknowledging and admitting that you don't have all of the answers. Asking for help. Oftentimes I'll ask my coaching clients, what does support look like for you? What does it mean? What would it look like for you to ask for help? Many of them have never even grappled with the idea of someone else helping them. That's sad. If we can't even think of how others can support us and help us, then how are we ever going to get the help and support that we need? We first have to be able to identify it and then be vulnerable and courageous enough to ask for it. Admitting when you're overwhelmed. I've noticed when I'm vulnerable and I share, I was overwhelmed. I've been through a lot. Usually what happens, it leads to greater community and connection. Usually there's someone who's nodding, someone who feels seen, someone who feels heard, and someone who's willing to acknowledge that I too have been there or I'm there now. I feel less alone. Empathy allows shame to lose its power. The more you're willing to share more of yourself, the more you're willing to ask for help, the more shame will lose its power. Sharing ideas. Many people don't feel psychologically safe within their organizations. Many people don't feel psychologically safe to take that seat at the table and to share what they're seeing, what's to come. They don't feel that they're going to be heard. They feel that they're going to be penalized. That takes a lot of vulnerability and courage. If not you, then who? Again, many of you have so much advanced knowledge and experience within your organizations. You know everything, literally. When I worked for an organization with an HR department, I went to them for everything. You know people's birthdays, you know everything. And so again, if you're not feeling psychologically safe and you're not willing to lean in and be vulnerable and courageous, what are the implications within your organization? And then confronting unethical behavior. Oftentimes, similar to social work, HR gets a bad rep. In my experience, many of the leaders that I coach, they don't trust HR. They feel that HR is 100% there to support the company, that HR is not looking out for the employees, that HR will always turn its back on the employees in favor of the company. I'm not an HR professional, and so you know your world better than me, but you're responsible for navigating unethical behavior even when it's at the top. What does that look like for you? Again, that's going to take a lot of vulnerability and courage. How many of you consider yourself to be resilient? All right, okay. Nice show of hands. And so creating a resilient workplace and culture is crucial to success, but many people aren't resilient. If you're feeling all these fears and feelings and you're burnt out, are you actually going to have the grit? Are you actually going to have the tenacity to persevere through all the setbacks? Again, the Great Resignation didn't happen, overnight for no reason. Many people, they had been resilient until they no longer could be resilient. Resilience is about the ability to adapt and thrive in the face of challenges and changes. And leaders play a critical role in modeling resilience. As I mentioned, you all know everything. It's hard knowing everything within an organization, which means people look to you to be the model of good behavior, to be the model of how we should do things, how we should show up, how we should adapt, what empathy looks like, how to have a positive mindset. But again, you're still human. So you're still human, but you're expected to be perfect, and you're expected to model all this healthy behavior within your organizations. You can't do that without vulnerability, and you can't do it without courage. So in organizations where vulnerability is viewed as a weakness, the culture encourages us to protect our egos by shutting off our emotions and hiding our true selves. These environments reward behaviors like perfectionism, emotional detachment, and the artificial separation of our personal and professional lives. Many of us have worked in places where vulnerability is seen as a weakness or a liability. The implications for this is perfectionism. I mentioned I'm a perfectionist in recovery. Emotional detachment. During COVID, I always tell people, I went from being extroverted to extremely, extremely introverted. I became a chronic workaholic who realized that I needed to tend to myself, and I had no time for external relationships. The impact, detrimental. I'm still coming on the other side of it now. And then an artificial separation of our personal and professional lives. I'm not going to depress you further, but many statistics show that what everyone has navigated since the pandemic has led to a surge in separations as well as divorces. Not only have we experienced mental health challenges, but we're also losing our partners. We're losing critical people in our relationships. People are dying by suicide, which we're seeing in organizations, and we're seeing people have other chronic health conditions. And again, we spend 1/3 of our lives at work, which means it's even more critical that we grapple with these things that we're facing. The reluctance to embrace vulnerability within our organizations, it leads to surface level interactions. So if you think back to that list of barriers to courage, if you're having surface level interactions, what's the likelihood you're going to trust the people that you're working with? It's leading to situations where real issues aren't going addressed. Again, people don't know how to have tough conversations. What are the implications for all of you? And opportunities for growth and innovation are stifled. Deeper connections are lost. I love work. I love the work that I do. And so for me, if I go to a place of employment, I want to enjoy. We don't have to be friends, but I want to enjoy the people I work with, and I want to work within a positive culture. I want to wake up feeling good in the morning. And right now, many of us don't have organizations that take pride in that. We may say it, but again, many organizations have gauzy values. They're not necessarily practicing what they preach. Many of us carry armor. Armor is a defense mechanism. And so as opposed to showing who we truly are and leaning into our authentic selves, many of us wear this armor or this facade to protect ourselves from being hurt, which leads to a likelihood of limited connection. You all are bridge builders within the organization. Your role is unique and influential. When I asked you how many of you had a seat at the table, unfortunately, some of you might have been shy, but I only saw a few hands. You do have a seat at the table. Your role is critical. I have many friends who work in HR, and I often say, if you walked out tomorrow, then what? Literally, if you walked out tomorrow, then what? There is significant power in your position. You are bridges, and you are also the heart of your organizations. Many people look to you as that role model of good, healthy practice, not only in terms of organizational values, but if the HR leader never takes time off, if the HR leader often looks, frantic and tired and overwhelmed and burnt out, what tone does that set for the rest of the organization? And what does it mean, again, for you to begin taking care of yourself and recognizing the immense power that you hold within your organization? So the heart of daring leadership. I mentioned that vulnerability is a prerequisite to courage, and that there's many, many, many barriers to courage within organizations. Many people have never seen a courageous organization. They don't know what it looks like, and they don't know what it feels like. And so today's conversation is a starter to get you thinking about the important role that you play, but also to remember your why. Why did you choose to go this route? What do you love about your work? What inspires you? And what significant shifts can you make to feel better in your day-to-day lives? So the first tenet of daring leadership, you can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. Again, vulnerability is a prerequisite to courage. So even though it may be uncomfortable to admit that you don't know something, to admit that you need support, to admit that you're burnt out and you need to take PTO, that you need additional support and resources, that you don't feel psychologically safe, that you need to go to this training in order to support the organization, even though that might be uncomfortable, you're not going to get the courageous coacher you seek without embracing that vulnerability. Embrace the suck. It's uncomfortable, but in order to get to love, belonging, joy, connection, innovation, all the things that we truly desire within our organizations, you absolutely have to be willing to embrace the suck. And the good thing about it, the more willing you are to be vulnerable, the more you'll realize that you're not alone. Every time I share with people what I've been through and what I experience, like clockwork, people will come up to me and pull me aside and say, "Thank you for sharing your story. I feel seen." I've never heard anybody else say this in a public setting. Again, shame derives power from being unspoken. The more you can lean into vulnerability and acknowledge what support you need, the more you'll realize you're not alone. Self-awareness and self-love matter. As a social worker and a former therapist, it's actually kind of weird for me to acknowledge that most people aren't very self-aware. Most people don't know themselves. Most people don't even know who their authentic self is. We've all been conditioned to a certain level of professionalism within our organization. We've all adapted and have been trained to show up a certain kind of way. But who are you authentically? How aware are you of the impact that you're having when you show up at work? When you're feeling sad and overwhelmed, does your misery love company? Are you becoming reactive? Are you also someone who's leading to the toxic culture within your organizations? How self-aware are you? When you grapple with your feelings, do you even grapple with your feelings? Again, if you do, what do you notice? What do you see in the mirror? And then self-love matters. As a helping professional, I know you're tasked with so much. Again, without you, what would people do? Scary reality. We need HR. But how are you taking care of yourself? Dr. Krista Neff, she's a researcher on self-compassion. What she's found is that most people don't talk to themselves the way they love. I'm a beginner golfer, and so I've been golfing for about a year. And again, I'm a perfectionist in recovery and a chronic achiever, so golfing has been crazy. I almost gave up golfing within the first couple times I was out there. I was just F-bombs and cursing unlike any other. And what happened is I realized I couldn't be perfect at this sport. That in front of everybody, here I am out on the green, on the fairway, and my mistakes are right there in front of me for me to see and experience, but for everybody else that I'm playing with. That was extremely difficult. And then for me, I almost gave up because why would I want to put myself through this? That's when I started feeling shame. And so now I'm a little bit more accustomed to, my fumbles when I'm out there, but it's really interesting as a coach to see people and their negative self-talk. I will golf with players where they'll not get the drive that they expected and they'll throw their club. They'll start screaming. I was playing with someone the other day, and he starts yelling at himself, and he's literally just, you're watching this little spiral of turmoil. And again, how do you talk to yourself? Are you talking to yourself the way you talk to people that you love? How aware are you of yourself, your feelings, your emotions, and your action? If you're not in touch with your feelings, which many of us aren't, we're not even taught to have an expansive emotional vocabulary. What happens is we feel a certain kind of way, we immediately think a thought, and then we act, and then we have regrets later on. And so the more emotionally literate, the more emotionally intelligent we can be, then likelihood of greater self-awareness and the likelihood of greater self-love. And so if you don't love yourself, if you're not self-compassionate with yourself, again, what's the likelihood you're going to take care of yourself? What's the likelihood you're going to ask for support? To scale daring leadership and build courage, we must cultivate a culture in which brave work, tough conversations, and whole heart are the expectation, and armor is not necessary or rewarded. I've worked for plenty of places where armor is the expectation and it is rewarded, which leads to a lot of very competitive people, a lot of people who aren't vulnerable, a lot of people who are hiding their true feelings, and the culture is extremely toxic and cutthroat. I don't like working in those type of places. It's not good for my spirit. It's not good for my health. It's not good for me. And so all of us, again, whether you have that seat at the table now, whether you want to take it or not, the reminder that people are watching you. You're all role models. And so if you desire a more daring, courageous culture, it starts with one person. It starts with you, then somebody else will notice, and then it can have a trickle effect within your team. And what this looks like is embracing and encouraging transparency without penalization, embracing difficult conversations, and even teaching people how to have it. Many organizations I've seen have divested in leadership development, such as this. And so how are people expected to get better and be more comfortable with psychological safety and difficult conversations if it's not a budget line item? We have to prioritize spending money on the things that we need and want within our cultures. And we have to recognize our employees as whole people. We're all human. So, sustainable growth. So again, I've talked about all of the things you all have navigated since the pandemic. I've talked about some of the changing trends within HR, the future of HR, and how you're going to need to step up and take that seat at the table. And I've talked about the very important role of vulnerability and courage in your leadership. Vulnerability is a prerequisite to courage, and in order to embrace it, you're going to have to lean on that leadership toolkit. You're going to have to pull out all of your resources that you use for others and actually use them for yourself. So self-compassion. How often are you affirming yourself? How often are you recognizing your gifts and talents? I mean, throughout my talk, I've told you that you're unicorns, that you're amazing, that you have power, that you do all these incredible things. But do you actually recognize it? Do you actually know your worth? Do you actually know how valuable you are? And if so, how are you supporting yourself and extending that love and compassion to yourself? We all experience setbacks. It's part of the human experience. I learned it on the golf round, setbacks every single time. And I could have quit. I could have decided I wasn't good enough. I could have gone into a shame spiral, but I realized this was something that I wanted to do, and I needed to get back out there. When I experienced hardship in the organization that I worked for, when I didn't feel supported, I could have latched those golden handcuffs a little bit tighter and just dealt with it and decided that this was where I needed to be and where I had to remain in order to survive and pay my rent. I could have decided that entrepreneurship was too scary and not worth it, but instead I remembered my value, I remembered my worth, I affirmed myself, and I got out there. Again, setbacks are part of the human experience, and unless you learn self-compassion and how to tend to yourself and take care of yourself, it's going to be incredibly difficult. Cultivating emotional intelligence. Oftentimes I'll ask people, how are you feeling? And most people will say, good. Good is not an emotion. Or they'll say, okay, fine. Okay and fine are not emotions. How in tune are you with how you're feeling and how it's showing up? What are you doing to increase your self-awareness? The more self-aware we are about ourselves, the greater likelihood we'll be able to lean into empathy and understand and support other people. Again, you all are HR professionals. You know this. You probably tell other people this, but are you practicing this for yourself? Again, I shared that emotional picture of me because that was me leaning into my emotional intelligence. After I gave the talk, I was a little embarrassed, but I literally looked at a feelings chart and I processed through all of the feelings and emotions I was feeling, and I got to the root cause, and I decided how I wanted to feel moving forward and what actions I needed to take control of my destiny, to be that captain of my ship. And hiring an executive coach or therapist. I used to be a therapist, and now I'm a coach. Oftentimes I tell people, leaders need support. Leadership is lonely at the top. Again, you all know so much, but you can't often share what you know with other people. You can't often go to others within your organization and say, I don't really understand this. I'm worried about this, which is why it's important for you to have external people in your network to lean on for support, which can look like an executive coach or a therapist. ICF, which is the International Coaching Foundation, they found that organizations became more profitable and more productive when they leaned into coaching. And so coaching, many of you, again, likely referred people to coaches, but are you using one for yourself? Coaching can help you with your work performance, your relationships, as well as your communication skills. And then therapy. Many people feel that therapy, similar to vulnerability, is a dirty word. They're uncomfortable with the idea of going to someone for support and sharing what they've been through. But we all need someone to talk to, and we as people, we are not meant to navigate this world alone. And then seek support networks. You're all here for a reason. Yes, to learn, but networking is a key part of a conference such as this. And many people don't do it. Many people will go to the same table, they'll go to the same people that they know, and they won't take advantage of the opportunity before them. And so here you are with other people within your industry from across the country. How are you going to take advantage of this opportunity? How are you going to lean into this network for a source of support? The more conversations you have with each other, the more you'll realize that you're not alone. And it doesn't just have to be about data analytics and what you're doing for your organization in terms of balancing compensation. It can be about how you're navigating the difficult terrain that you're up against. How many of you have taken a vacation this year? Okay, about a little more than half. Most people do not take their PTO. And when they do, most people are taking their laptop. Most people are on their phone. Most of us as people are addicted to social media now. We cannot, go a couple minutes without looking at our phone. But are you actually taking the time for rest and rejuvenation? Are you actually taking your hard-earned time and spending time with your family, your friends, spending time with yourself? We have to take our PTO. Vacations are not a luxury. They're a necessity if we want to sustain a high performance. And if you're not prioritizing that rest, again, who you are is how you lead. It will have implications for yourself as well as your organizational culture. Vacations will allow you to regain perspective, recharge, and come back with renewed energy as well as creativity. And again, you are the heart of the organization. You all have been through so much, but you are crucial to the success of your organizations. Your role is extremely pivotal in the future of your organization, not just in sustaining policies, procedures around equity, around employee experience, around strategy. You are, again, the foundation of your organization. And until you take care of yourself, that foundation is crumbling. And so I mentioned this to say, the future is here. Are you ready? You are powerful people. You have immense value. And I encourage you to step into your vulnerability, step into your courage, take that rightfully earned spot at the table, and show up as the leaders that you want to be and the leaders that you want to model for your organization. Thank you. All right. I did it. As a perfectionist in recovery, this is really difficult. All right, so now we're going to do Q&A. We have about 15 minutes and the time just started. So I know I talked about a lot of different things. You all can ask me anything you want, honestly, about what I shared in the presentation, about the work I do as an executive coach, about my background, about trends and things that I'm seeing within organizations. The floor is now yours. Oh, that was fast.
I just have a question about having those difficult conversations, those tough conversations, and how we can encourage our other leaders to have those difficult conversations with their staff and not be the ostrich, because I deal with ostriches every single day.
Oh my gosh, I've never heard the term ostrich as it pertains to difficult conversations, but I can see that. I can see how your HR, can you go have this difficult conversation? Can you go do this? And you're like, me again? How come you can't have it? So what I would do is I would ensure that all of the leaders within the organization went through a training that teaches them how to have the crucial conversation, because most people don't know how to have them, which is why they don't want to do them. They don't want to embrace the discomfort. And when you have HR who will do it for you, it's easier to never have to learn those tools and navigate it. And if your organization doesn't have the time or the financial resources to invest in a training, there's YouTube, there's podcasts, there's other resources. You can even sit down with them and say, I'm not going to have the conversation this time, but I'm going to guide you through, we can role play how I typically have it so that you can be set up for success. But then for you as HR, you can get an idea of where they're starting and how much growth they need in order to help set them up for success so that their tough conversations can be sustainable moving forward.
Is it on? Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about when you mentioned that executives need more support, maybe even therapy, and how you make sure that that's provided. As far as we might have an EAP program, but with the shame and everything that goes around that, as far as like the armor and all of that, how do you encourage them to use those resources?
Yeah, so I'll talk about it in a couple of different ways. So when I'm coaching a leader, because I've been a therapist, I can usually tell when someone needs therapy. And so it's not really hard, surprisingly. But typically what I'll do is in the beginning of a coaching engagement, I'll do an expansive needs assessment where we're untackling their behaviors, their beliefs, their mindsets. I'm unearthing some of their past traumas. And based on the conversations, I'll dive deeper to get to the root cause of their behavior. And many of them will start getting very emotional. And I'll realize there's a lot of untapped stuff, oftentimes coming back from childhood that they've never dealt with that is going to show up for them as leaders. So what I'll do as a coach, if I see that, I require, in order for us to move forward, that you have to get a therapist. Your first homework assignment is to tap in and to find a therapist. And most people, once they come to me for coaching, they desperately want support. And so they're willing to go get a therapist in order to continue the coaching. But then for organizational leaders, like if I serve on a couple boards, I'm not just going to say, you should get a therapist, and I'm not going to say it publicly, but I'll offer, similar to your toolkit, a few different resources for consideration. Sometimes what people need is just a support group. I'm also, I don't know if you've ever heard of Chief, but Chief is an executive, it's an executive networking membership group for executive women across the country. And so groups such as that, groups such as this, where you could be in groups of maybe 5 or 6 and talk about what you're navigating, oftentimes that's therapeutic for people. And oftentimes during those conversations, hearing another leader that you respect indicate that they have a coach or therapist will allow you to know that it's okay if you went and sought one for yourself as well. Yeah. Another question back there?
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I have two questions pretty much pertaining to the same thing. On one of your slides, you did state that roughly, I think it was 45 or 4.5 million people decided to exit out of the workforce after the pandemic in 2021. Was that just in the United States, or was that nationwide, the calculation on that?
That calculation was within the U.S.
Okay, within the U.S. And also, do you have any type of research or study as far as how many of those people decided to come back into the workforce? Have they decided, hey, I wanted to take a chance? Because I do know a lot of people during the pandemic decided to become entrepreneurs, and then within the next year or two, they decided to come back into the workforce. So I just wanted to see, did you have any type of data or information pertaining to people that may have decided to come back into the workforce?
Yeah, no, great question. So the data was for the U.S., and to your point, many people decided to leave because of toxic workplaces, because of workplaces that weren't grappling with DEI issues with managers. Managers tend to be the number one reason why people leave or stay. Caretaking, as well as a host of other issues. But to your point over here, many people became entrepreneurs and many people started returning. But one of the things that we're currently seeing is, because so many organizations are remote now and they have hybrid policies, it's extremely competitive now, and it's harder to get a job, which is why there's rising rates of unemployment. I don't have the data right now, but if you email me, I could certainly send you some of the research around the return rate since the Great Resignation.
Thank you.
Of course. If you see me going like this, it's because there's 2 bright lights directly in my face. Any other questions?
Obviously, in HR, there's a lot of managing up and things like that. And I wanted to know how you would recommend addressing, you said shame was the #1 tool that many managers use to motivate their employees. How should someone broach that subject with a manager who needs maybe to have a little come to Jesus moment about how they're leading their people? And you're probably seeing the effect of that. It's a very sensitive subject when you're talking to someone about how they lead their teams. So do you have any pointers on how someone might address that with someone?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so my disclaimer for this one is I wouldn't just go up to your boss and say, are you experiencing shame? But I might say, because oftentimes, again, who you are is how you lead. So oftentimes people are navigating things behind the scenes that you don't know about and that they don't feel, based on their leadership title or position, they can be vulnerable about, and it's seeping out. And so if you're noticing different behaviors in your manager or boss that are counter-culture, I just say, like, are you okay? Do you need someone to talk to? Do you have support? Is there any? And so I would try to lean in from that therapeutic coaching perspective to try to get a sense of what else they're navigating, what fears and feelings they are having, which is showing up in this hostile way. But then I'd also get the courage to perhaps say, I would speak for myself. Many people might say, we've noticed. I'd say, I've noticed you've been different lately. Is everything okay? Is there anything? And your boss might say, what do you mean? And I'd have examples, always have examples. At performance evaluations, always have examples. And I'd have my examples, before you were more this way, lately you've been this way. I'm starting to hear people talking about it. Many people are fearful around you. It's starting to have these implications. And I know this isn't like you. I know this isn't the type of culture that you want. Is there anything that I could do to support you? What can we do together in order to navigate this? And I wouldn't make them feel targeted or like you're judging them, but I try to make them feel seen, supported, and like they're not alone in navigating the pressures that they're navigating. Because again, leadership is lonely at the top. When things go wrong, oftentimes it's the CEOs and the top executives who face a lot of pressure, HR included, but the board comes first to those, the executive team. And oftentimes they keep things close to the chest because they don't want everyone else to worry or feel the fear or the anxiety that they're currently experiencing. But unfortunately, it comes out in other ways. Great question. Any other questions?
How do you go about selecting an executive coach?
Ooh, good question. So you should interview numerous people. And so the thing about executive coaches, we all have completely different styles, personalities, ways of working. We have different credentials, different experience within different industries. We have different certifications. We use different tools. Some of us are more like advisors, thought partners. Some people are very by the book, just asking you a ton of questions. And so what I would do if I was interviewing an executive coach, I think about what are the primary areas that I want support, and I'd first assess my readiness for coaching. Am I actually committed to this process, to homework assignments, and to somebody external holding me accountable to doing these things that I say that I'm going to do, even amidst how busy I am? So am I fully ready for this? And then what I would do is I'd identify some criteria that I want in a coach. Do I want someone with HR experience? Do I want a woman? Do I want a man? Do I want someone from a diverse background? Do I want someone who's been coaching for a specified amount of time? Do I want someone who appears more warm and authentic, or someone who's a little bit more straightforward and direct? I would think about what I want and what I need from a coach, and then I would interview quite a few people and really see who's a good fit for me in order to move forward. And again, it's like dating. So you might choose someone and you realize after a couple sessions, this isn't going to work. And it's okay for you to break your coaching contract and to let them know that you'd like to pursue, coaching from someone else. But I would do all of those things first before settling on a coach.
Lakeya, two quick questions. One of them is most people aren't intentionally unself-aware. So are there any pro tips on helping them become, or helping even ourselves become more self-aware? We don't know what we don't know. And then secondly, besides executive coaching, is the topic something that can be done in a group management training or a series of group management trainings? Mm-hmm.
So for the first question with self-awareness, this is why I talk about emotional literacy. And so the more you're in tune with your feelings, then you'll know your thoughts, and then you'll be able to address your behaviors. And so what I tell my clients is, say for instance, right now, you're sitting here, you're watching me, you're listening. What are you feeling? Are you feeling excitement, irritation, disgust, curiosity? Like, what are you feeling? Like, really, really try to name that emotion. And then if you can name the emotion, what thoughts are now coming to your head? Based on that feeling, what thoughts are coming to your head? And what are you wanting to do? Are you wanting to lean in more? Are you feeling uncomfortable and you're wanting? And the more you start training your brain to act in that way in different situations, the more you're going to be self-aware and be able to stop yourself from doing something that perhaps you have regrets over later. But it's a practice, and it's a practice that many of us are not trained to do or enact. And then for the next one, executive coaching. Beyond executive coaching, there's team coaching. I'm also a team coach. And so, for example, if you have a team where you're not getting along, it's always the same person who's talking, the dynamics could benefit from improvement, then you can hire a coach to come into your meetings and to help you all to learn how to navigate working together a little bit more effectively. There's also group coaching, which is like group therapy, where I host a couple of public sessions of people of color in leadership roles who come and they talk about the challenges that they're navigating within their workplace. And then the other leaders, based on their experience, will share how they navigated something similar and what advice they have. And then there's also coaching circles. And then coaching circles is me as a coach teaching you all how to coach yourself and then putting you in smaller groups or breakouts so that you could, again, just coach each other one-on-one in that private scenario with the issues that you're navigating. So coaching doesn't have to be one-on-one. There are other modalities and ways of exploring it. Any other questions? No? I will happily get off the stage. All right, well, again, all of you are the heart of HR. I have so much respect for the crucial role that you play in organizations. I see you. Again, I know what you've navigated. I've certainly been there. But I also know how vital you are to the sustainability of your organizations. And if you don't take care of yourself, then you're not going to be able to continue pouring, and your organizations are not going to be able to do the critical things that they're currently doing. So I hope as you kickstart this conference, this is a reminder to love on yourself a little bit more, lean into yourself, be vulnerable, ask for support, get the resources you need so that you can sustain yourself and help sustain the organization moving forward. So thank you all.